Welcome to all of you to our third event of the new book forum, Science, Medicine, Environment, and a warm welcome especially to our guests today, Professor Matthew Hunter of McGill University, and also to my co-moderators, Stephan Graf, hello, and Vera, Wolff. So my name is Monika Wulz. I'm a postdoc in the history and philosophy of science and the coordinator of the doctoral program History of Knowledge in Zurich. And together with Lisa Haushofer from the History of Medicine at the University of Zurich and Niels Güttler, who is a postdoc at the Chair of Science Studies, also here in Zurich, we founded the new book forum as a trans-institutional young scholars initiative last year in light of the pandemic in order to showcase and discuss new books in the fields that connect us, that is the history of science, of medicine, environment, and related fields. The new book forum is a Zurich-based initiative. We would like, however, to contribute to connecting researchers across distances and across institutions and disciplines. And I'm happy to see people from diverse places and disciplines in the audience also today. In this way, we would like to also contribute to an exchange on new research related to the sciences, to knowledge, environment, and in focus of our discussion today, to the arts and the history. The book in focus of the session, Matthew Hunter's Painting with Fire, Sir Joshua Reynolds' Photography and the Temporally Evolving Chemical Object, fits perfectly in our series of books, of discussions, both in its thematic focus as well as its disciplinary perspective. It connects the history of art in the long 18th century with the history of science, especially of chemistry, focusing on both art and science as processes engaging in temporally unstable chemical objects. It is this focus on the ephemeral that is the core of Matthew's book, and that opens up the problem of stabilizing and reproducing art and images by ways of chemical experimentation. In this way, the book enables a long-term perspective, bringing together painting, photography, and other forms of visual practices with the chemicals that make up modernity and with the issues of production and combustion in the era of industrialization. The book does also introduce the history of art as part of the history of the Anthropocene and its industrial environments. So some words on the format of the discussion. The first part will be a panel discussion including Matthew, Stephan, Vera, and myself. After about 30 minutes, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please type a Q for a question in the chat. And the session, as you see, will be recorded and will be made available on our homepage later. Officially, the session is 60 minutes long. We will, however, leave the Zoom link open for about 20 more minutes in case you would like to engage in a more informal conversation with our guest. So now, before Stephan will introduce Matthew to you, let me briefly introduce Stephan and Vera, so in order you know who is interacting here on the scene. So I'm very happy that we could convince Vera Wolff, Dr. Vera Wolff, a dear and long-standing colleague in Zurich at the ETH Chair for Science Studies, to co-moderate the discussion. Vera is now based at the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, the Max Planck Institute for Art History. She is currently working on her second book, dealing with the Cold War relations of science, industry, and art, as well as on a larger research project, Materialist Art History of Globalization. Related to this latter research project is her book Die Rache des Materials, eine andere Geschichte des Japonismus, The Material's Revenge, as it would be translated, that was published in 2015, in which she offers a discourse history of Japanese art since the 19th century. And last but not least, Stephan Graf holds a master's degree from ETH in History and Philosophy of Knowledge. Currently, he is a doctoral candidate at the Chair for Science Studies and a member of the doctoral program History of Knowledge. In his research project, he focuses on photographic processes beyond big pictures, studying the 20th century history of basic research on photography, both in the photographic industry and at universities, as well as the relations between these sites of research. So having said that, I pass on the word to Stephan.
Hi everyone, a big thank you also from my side to Matthew Hunter for joining us today to discuss this exciting book, and also many thanks to the fantastic people of the New Book Forum for organizing and hosting this discussion. It's my great pleasure to quickly introduce Matthew Hunter before we dive into this discussion. Matthew Hunter's research focuses on visual art and architecture of the long 18th century, with particular emphasis on their interactions with science and technology. Since 2016, he's been associate professor at the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University in Montreal. His first book, Wicked Intelligence, Visual Art and the Science of Experiment in Restoration London, published in 2013, explored how in the late 17th century experimental visual practice of Royal Society members was deeply connected to artistic cultures, thereby controversially reconfiguring artistic traditions of Restoration England. Matthew's broader interest in bringing together art history and the history of science in order to critically engage with questions of representation, modeling, and materiality, or in his own words, to explore interfaces between physical materials and cognitive processes, is also expressed in the 2010 volume Beyond Mimesis and Convention, Representation in Art and Science, which he co-edited with philosopher Roman Fricke. This interest is also present in numerous article and book chapters he published thereafter, for example, in the most recent 2020 piece, Modeling: A Secret History of Following. Finally, Matthew is also an editor of the journal Grey Room, which you all know, where he edited a special issue on liquid intelligence in 2017, and where he's currently working on a special issue on the aerial image in collaboration with Emily Doucet, who's also here, and Nick Robbins, if I'm not mistaken. This issue is forthcoming this spring. As an aspiring historian of science focusing on 20th century physical-chemical research on photographic processes, I find Painting with Fire an exciting contribution to a broader material history of painting and photography, broadening the field of the history of chemistry. So I'm very happy to hand over to Vera. Vera for her first question.
I'll be very short with the thank yous. As you know, we Germans are rude. So thank you so much for being here, Matthew, albeit only virtually and wherever our shared here may really be. I'm also really glad to see so many of you whom I miss in times of the pandemic. And to get this clear, this venue is not only to connect us, but also you in the audience with each other. So before we open the discussion, Stephan and I would like to get the conversation going and introduce the audience to Matthew Hunter's book with some questions of our own. My first question is perhaps really the academic equivalent of a conversation piece. It concerns the seemingly improbable relation between the paintings of Sir Joshua Reynolds, first president of the Royal Academy from its founding in 1768, and the combustion engine. So how can Reynolds' paintings be seen as a moment in the history of combustion? Matthew.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you all for being here. Thank Stephan for the invitation. This is a seemingly improbable intersection, perhaps, but it began with a very basic insight or recognition. The fact that on the one hand, Joshua Reynolds, painter of society portraits and so on and so forth, first president of the Royal Academy, as you know, has long been known among picture conservators and picture collectors as a maker of deeply unstable objects frequently fabricated from highly combustible materials. Secondly, he is also a theorist of academic art as focusing around the command of the arts of fire. These are two pretty basic insights from which the project, or basic recognitions from which the project began. And from those points, which are, I will say, present in the technical literature on Reynolds, but fairly far away from the ways in which humanistic art historians have tended to talk about Reynolds in recent decades, a couple larger concerns emerged, joining Reynolds and sort of story of combustion. And the first of these had to do with the ways in which the chemical materials that change in time in and around Reynolds's pictures, the ways that they're used to sort of dream about time, are also some of the key materials that now count as technofossils or geostratigraphical markers in, say, geological attempts to date the advent of the Anthropocene, or more globally, the time of fossil fuel combustion. It struck me that that was interesting. Perhaps we could go to the images to let me show you further exactly what that means. Our year is 1771. What we're looking at is Joseph Wright of Derby's painting called The Alchemist in Search of the Philosopher's Stone, discovers phosphorus and prays for the successful conclusion of his operation, as was the custom of the ancient chemical astrologers. This is a painting that looks back from 1771 to the 1670s, where a number of chemists in German-speaking lands are themselves looking back to the year 1603. It's in 1603 that a Bolognese craftsman named Vincenzo Cascariolo calcines local stone around Bologna and produces a material, phosphorus, that is able to receive and relay light. Now, circa 1670, a number of chemists produce a synthetic phosphorus, or a range of different synthetic phosphorus preparations, frequently fabricated from human waste, human urine, and human feces. These are understood to produce various highly interesting phenomena. They burn without heat, they store and they relay light, they decay in their sensitivity to light in time. These are brought, they're transmitted, they're gifted to major figures in the early Royal Society of London. King Charles II, the institution's patron, Robert Boyle, and so on and so forth. And in the British context, particularly emerging and circulating through this physiological tradition that dates back to the experimental clubs of 1650s Oxford, artificial phosphorus is understood to interact with an array of questions bearing on light, organic life, and combustion. So it is physically applied to art to make it glow in the dark. Robert Hooke, Boyle's former assistant, secretary of the Royal Society, has a recipe for doing this, but it's the change of artificial phosphorus in time, its capacity to yield light in the darkness, sustain or store light, but then to decay out of sensitivity to light, is taken by Hooke in this stunning 1682 lecture that he delivers twice at the Royal Society on the nature of time itself. So chemical materials that change in time become a way, a device for conceptualizing the nature of time. Now, move back to 1771, where Wright is taking up this invention or reinvention of phosphorus as a subject for painting. He's doing so in a way that's not terribly surprising, right? As a painter who's long been associated with the Lunar Society of Birmingham, this important natural philosophical group which meets on full moon nights to discuss matters pertaining to natural philosophy, and it includes Matthew Boulton, James Watt, Josiah Wedgwood, and others. He's also, Wright has made his reputation in the 1760s for showing these candlelight scenes of scientific inquiry, culled from the history of then recent science, so air pumps, orreries, and so on and so forth. And he's also showing this picture in 1771 at an institution in the Society of Artists of Great Britain that teaches chemistry and pigment making. So maybe we can move to our second slide, because this is the point of contrast, is also 1771. This is the rendering, the apparently abandoned, unfinished rendering, now in a significant state of material decay, executed by the head of the rival institution to the Society of Artists of Great Britain, that is the Royal Academy. This is Joshua Reynolds painting his banker friend, James Coutts, on a mahogany panel. Now, by the 1770s, Reynolds has acquired a reputation for technical facture that one recent conservator has described as nothing short of perverse. He has a sound grounding in artistic training. In fact, he and Wright they apprenticed with the same painter, Thomas Hudson. And yet Reynolds quickly embraces an array of materials: egg, wax, asphaltum, bitumen, resins, varnishes, all manner of experimental media appear in his paintings. Part of the work that the book does is to try to track the advent and the emergence into Reynolds's palette of these experimental materials from the chemical committees that he is assigned to participate on as a member of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce in the late 1750s. But we also know from fascinating letters written by Reynolds's own apprentice, James Northcote, in the 1770s, how materials and techniques bearing on metallurgy, the fabrication of scientific instruments, which is Northcote's own family business, are being imported and considered as facture clues for the fabrication of paint layers. So we have two painters, 1771, early 1770s, who are operating, coming out of the same milieu, where one, maybe we can go to the next slide where we see the two pictures together, where one in Wright is depicting chemical experimentation. Reynolds is literally performing it. He is fabricating this into the paint layers of his pictures. At the same time in the 1770s, specifically 1774 in his sixth discourse, he positions this command of metallurgy, this operation of fire, as a nice chemistry through which the academic artist's transmutation of past detritus of the artistic tradition will be elevated into pure gold. This is his reframing of academic artistic making as chrysopoieia. So these are controversial statements. Reynolds is quickly satirized as being like a wizard who commands fire with a wand. He's then lampooned as rising up from the grave underneath this combusting alchemical phoenix, so on and so forth. So what is also extremely interesting is that what quickly happens is that a number of industrialists body forth, intent upon fabricating chemical replicas of Reynolds's chemically destabilizing paintings as a way to carry his project forward into time. In the work of Matthew Boulton and James Watt at the Soho Manufactory in Birmingham, which of course is best known for among historians of science and technology for the partnership that makes patents and sort of industrializes the most efficient version in the period of the steam engine, applies it to rotary motion. They are fabricating replicas of Reynolds paintings from the 1770s. These competing technologies expand in their scope, and the latter half of the book, the last chapter especially, shows what happens in the 1860s, when these replicas are unearthed. They are taken as, they're identified as photographs, and they're taken as evidence that photography had been invented in the last quarter of the 18th century. But at the same time, they're being redeployed as containing potential fuels for combustion engines, for aircraft engines in particular. So linking Reynolds and combustion, I think, means opening an inquiry between shared material grounds, between pictorial art and combustion engine research, asphaltum, bitumen, resins in particular as being important, and thinking about artistic interest in chemicals that change in time as a threshold for what Marshall Solins calls a native anthropology of Western society as it begins to encounter this new planetary time made by fossil capital, whether we choose to call that the Anthropocene, the Cthulhucene, or whatever variant is your choice.
My question concerns the contribution you make to the history of photography. And I think you make two important contributions to the history and theory of photography. The first is that you don't approach photography as something fundamentally different from painting, but let's say you explore similarities between the two, maybe not so much on a visual, but on a material level. And secondly, you explicitly refrain from interpreting chemical practices that might be classified in hindsight as not quite successful proto-photographic practices on a linear history leading up to the invention of photography in the beginnings of the 19th century. And both of these interventions become possible because you place not only photography, as you explained, but also painting in a longer and broader history of chemistry, I would say. Could you tell us a little bit more about what this entails, what it exactly means to follow the chemicals and how this brings you mentioned it before a little bit, how this brings you to photography and to the history of photography?
Yeah, thanks for the great question. I'm happy to talk a little bit more broadly about this, but my first book was bumping up against a inquiry into a field of scientific visuality, scientific representation, however you want to describe that exactly, in certain ways constrained by postmodern theory of photography. And I've found a couple components of standing postmodern photo theory that I had encountered as a grad student just a million years ago now, but the insistence on ontological questions, for example, debates around indexicality, for example, questions of intentionality as being dominant in inquiries toward the photographic image. Those ways of framing the problematic, for example. Secondly, photo understood as largely an optical and a mechanical operation, wherein little attention at all was afforded to the chemical side of the equation, the wet side, as Jeff Wall termed it in an essay, Photography and Liquid Intelligence, which was hugely generative for this project and for my larger thinking in this direction. And so certainly the landscape has begun to change in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, the rough timeline of this project. But I also found a couple things totally critical for new kinds of thinking about the meetings of chemistry into painting and photography, other adjoining media. First of those was the massively insightful work coming out of the recent history of alchemy, for example. The work of Bill Newman, Pamela Smith, to a certain extent, Larry Principe, a number of these figures who have made the history of alchemy such a generative field of inquiry, where we see alchemy as this massively important site for a science of the transformation of matter. material science of transformation is the image of alchemy that emerges here, where the impact extends from metallurgy to medicine to the arts and far beyond. And they've historicized the pejorative vision of alchemy as just being about chrysopoieia and framed it as a much larger scale. And so seen in that light, it felt to me that available or familiar attempts to narrate or to organize chemical imaging toward the coming of photography or the coming of the desire to photograph began to feel not only arbitrary, but even violent. And a key figure for me was Thomas Wedgwood, who you sort of allude to here. Much of what we have known about Thomas Wedgwood and his involvement with photography comes from not Thomas Wedgwood, but from Humphrey Davy. And I'm being told I have to stop talking. I'm happy to talk more about Thomas Wedgwood because I love him. But the more I looked at this, the more I felt like Wedgwood's work and his openness to chemical materials that change in time is very easily and has very repeatedly been recast as a progenitor of photographic techniques. But it equally works, or more persuasively works, as an expression of his own philosophical project with apprehending time through and as chemical materials that change and resist fixation. And so it seems to me the key point here would be that what I think we should be doing is acting as historians and historicizing discrete moments in the lives and the life of chemical image making, rather than trying to shoehorn them into so many progressive steps on the way toward this teleological world entry in 1826 or 1839, or however you like to do it, wherein photography comes to articulate its own objectives. We should act as historians. I'll stop.
Thanks so much. Since time is advancing quite quickly, and I had a much too long introduction, but still, yeah. So maybe we take two more questions. One, I don't know if Stephan had another question back on that, or we go on with Vera. And okay.
I'll be quick.
And then we give over to the audience to also allow a broader discussion.
In our meeting before, you taught us the word sloganeering, and you made clear you don't like to sloganeer. Given that, we still want to know more about your methodological concerns. What are the methodological consequences of your endeavor? And how does your proposal of an elemental art history relate to the so-called material turn and the various new materialisms, and even to historical positions such as, for example, Gottfried Sempers, who argued that style arises from purpose, the technologies and the materials used for the production of an object?
That's great. We could talk about this for 2 hours. Don't worry, audience, we won't. Very briefly, I think that, first of all, the anti-technological, anti-materialist bias of academic art history, by which I mean the work of Alwa Riegel, as much as I love Riegel, runs very deep. And when I was asked by my wonderful hosts to represent my project, I was asked for 2 images. And I think this is not insignificant, because this is, again, the classic Wolffian art historical knowledge techniques of 2 images put in juxtaposition to one another, which I have, as we agreed to do before the session, arranged them just like that. So these formal techniques continue to inform how we organize our objects. When at some point in the future I return to teaching on campus, I will do so in a lecture hall or in a seminar room, and not in a chemistry lab. And I think that we neglect those points. Imagine we are post-disciplinary or something like this at our peril. So I would say the relations to materials are slightly vexed in this project. On the one hand, I think certainly I'm attracted to a number of materialisms, and I would say in general, the work that has meant the most to me as an art historian and coming from an art historical literature on materials are cases where the materials are visible, apprehensible, perhaps perceptible in the object in some significant way. And also what art historians tend to do is that they privilege those cases where the object is, as it were, self-aware or reflexive on and about its own materiality. But that's not really always useful in the world of chemical image making, I think. This is in part because many of these are proprietary technologies where the makers of these chemical images are industrialists who actively militate against the visibility of, or the comprehensibility of what their techniques are. They want to keep them hidden for monetary purposes, if nothing else. But secondly, they frequently abide in the preparatory stages of the production of imagery or the production of the representation. So there is no satisfactory yield. There's no perceptible thing to point at in the same way that Michael Cole can point at the poetics of cast bronze as blood in his study of Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus group or something like this, or Michael Baxendale can point to the star shake of limewood. There isn't that with many of the chemical artifacts with which I'm dealing. So this is why I found myself appealing to or attracted to a language of the elements. And as I understand it, the elements, at least in, say, the Empedoclean or the Platonic idioms, are the roots, the rhizomata of materials. They combine under forces of love and strife to shape material things, but they are not the materials themselves. And it seems to me that this is a useful, potentially useful analytic for thinking about what kinds of operations and artifacts one is dealing with in chemical terms. I'm also attracted to the simplicity, the elementary nature of the elements, as it were. Mendelev's table, mythically minted as a pedagogical instrument. And there's something about a number of the connections that I try to draw out in the book that has what felt to me like a highly elementary component to it. I couldn't believe there wasn't more work on, for example, the relations between Talbot's calotype work and his combustion engines, or the Niepce brothers' pyrelophore and their heliographs, where the same materials and the same techniques are made by the same people at nearly the same time. It seemed in a way so obvious. And I wanted to have a language and a conceptual framework for speaking about the obvious, which in our time of deep fakes and alternative facts feels like it has a kind of politics to it. So that's I'll leave it there.
Perhaps we can be quick and dirty with this last question, which is, well, the question that is most expected, perhaps, because relations of the arts and sciences have been very dominant in the last years in these two fields. But how do you read historical concepts and practices such as paintings as science, or painting as a science, or paintings as experiments, voiced by so many contemporaries against the more recent debates on the relationship between the arts and the sciences? Which means, how does your proposal relate to the recent years' perspectives on this relation, both in the history of science and in art history, In these, as we all know, questions of representation or the model as a paradigm loomed large, whereas industry or political power relations were more absent for a while.
I guess I would begin by saying that I was surprised to learn that prior to being the president of the Royal Academy of Arts, Joshua Reynolds was a member of a group called the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacture, and Commerce. And in that capacity, from which emerged the mythical first ever contemporary art exhibition in Britain, organized in 1760. But Reynolds is also enfolded into a number of practical schemes for assessing 200 pounds of verdigris pigment, for example, alongside chemists. And he's identified as someone who should try the newly reenacted or recreated encaustic preparation that has been unearthed from the research of the Comte de Caylus, informed by the uncovering of encaustic paintings and Herculean on Pompeii and so on and so forth. So there is a technical Reynolds there to be extracted. For my own work, I came at this project again, having written a first book on a cast of characters who matter very significantly for the history of science, that is Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren to a lesser extent, and image making in the early Royal Society of London. And there, again, I had written my dissertation and under the shadow of a vision of scientific visuality crafted primarily from the prism of Svetlana Alpers's Art of Describing, a book now 40 years old, but which has dominated much of the work written about the Royal Society since. And a work that casts scientific image making representation through and into a landscape shaped by a vision of photography. And so what I wanted to do in my first book was to, especially as I encountered the breadth and the strangeness of the representational schemes employed by Hooke and his colleagues that looked nothing like I had expected, having read the Alpersian informed scholarship, Chapin and Schaffer and all that sort of wonderful mid-80s stuff, early Latour, drawing things together and so on and so forth. What I found was a dappled world of extremely strange representational possibility. And so I found myself looking to the literature on modeling as a way to understand it, because here was a literature attentive to representations that are not visual or contain not only significant dimensions of stylization, but give place to work done with and around representation that can't be seen. And that was much in keeping with the artifacts that I was encountering in the archive. In a certain way, what my first book tries to do is to thematize that sort of taxonomy of dappled representational possibility and to historicize it by using the command of this vast array of strange artifacts as a way to understand why and how the early Royal Society figures privileged a conception of architecture, what they thought it was, what it did, how it served this kind of integrative function. But I guess in the time since, I've come to have my own doubts for various types of political reasons about the modeling paradigm, about some of the ins and outs of fictionalism. And I'd be happy to discuss this further, but I also want to recognize the time and open to the floor. I'd love to hear thoughts or questions if there are others.
So, I mean, yeah, I would like to invite you to give me a sign if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, I would also like to follow up with a question and actually also to talk about this political aspect of your book. Also reading your book, I found it really interesting how you address this question of the history of arts, of sciences in this industrial era, like also with very political observations in between, also I mean concerning environmental issues, but also concerning social issues that come up here and there. I mean, pointing to slavery behind all these materials and so on. Could you say something about, how you inflict, I mean, what brought also this kind of tone and to your language of the book, and also this kind of reflection? I found it really interesting, I think, in this way.
Sure, no, that's a great question. The book was written primarily in California in 2016-17, so punctuated right in the middle by the election of Donald Trump. And I would be lying if I were to say that that was not a factor in my orientation to the archive. I had written a first book called Wicked Intelligence. I had written a second book that was entitled, or I had simultaneously done a collection called The Clever Object. And I had anticipated or imagined at a certain stage that this book too would be framed a la Jeff Wall and his discussion of liquid intelligence, that this would also be a story of a kind of intelligence. But as I watched my cast of characters dreaming with the materials that are the making of the planet on fire that we now inhabit, I would say that I lost my confidence that what I was diagnosing, what I was following, was a story about intelligence at all. And that it seemed much more interesting to listen again to the kind of elemental pull that seems to seduce a number of the figures who I follow, who watch these chemical materials that change in time, use them as a mechanism for engendering or envisioning or dreaming some often very clever, very sophisticated vision of time or conceptualization of how temporality works. And again, the model of Thomas Wedgwood and his just stunning vision of imagining using artificial phosphorus and its sort of fading color changes and ephemeral effects and so on and so forth as a way to implant or cast out a vision of a time as a nidus, as a nest, as a womb that swells, that grows more intense, but is not quantitatively measurable, is not susceptible to linguistic rendering, even to visual depiction, something like this, but needs something like a unfixed chemical support to give it expression. These are people thinking and dreaming with these materials that have now made our precarious planetary condition. And it seemed to me that it was important to find a way to tell that story. So I think that's how I would say it.
Mm-hmm. No, it comes very much through to me that this kind of elite circle of people working there in the sciences and in the arts, it really shows this kind of strands that come up until the 19th and 20th century. And then you understand this kind of social history of this elite really in a different and very critical way. I found it very illuminating, having this perspective also in mind. Okay, so we have plenty of time also for questions still, also from our side. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's just a follow-up question on Monika's thing. So I unfortunately haven't been able to read the book yet, and thank you very much for giving us the insights into it. And I think the follow-up question is just, I mean, you mentioned the Anthropocene as a theoretical concept, and I think I'm curious. I mean, I already got an impression what it does for your book, but I wondered if you could place your book in a broader discourse of the interconnection of Anthropocene and art history and the art scene in general. I think I'm just curious how that fits into it, and how that, for you, from your perspective, kind of changes narratives within the history of science as well. So that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. I have sort of a little bit of a vexed relationship to the Anthropocene discourse. I mean, there are the important and many critiques of the Anthropocene discourse as such. And then there's also the fact that my book is a critique of using photography as a teleology for organizing stories of chemical image making. And then I myself simply appeal to a different kind of teleology in a certain way of saying, oh, and then there was, you know, isn't all of this that we've been following just all already a story about the coming of the world made by combustion? So I recognize this is a bit of a contradiction, to put it in those good old-fashioned terms, but maybe a necessary one, and maybe one that, again, turns our attention as art historian, or my attention as an art historian, back onto what it is that we do and how we organize our stories and what counts as a valid explanation. And do we look to preserve a sort of autonomous domain of art in which art has its own causations and it's looking to the world and then reporting back on them in schema that are always already informed by other works of art or something like this? Or if we're going to do a materialist or perhaps an elemental kind of art historical investigation, do we really need to deeply situate the makings of the artifacts on which we are investigating? Not simply thinking about how they depict or represent various kinds of industrial political processes, but are quite literally forged from them. And again, this is a number of artifacts analyzed in the book are made at the Soho manufactory of Boulton and Watt, which figures inevitably, or not inevitably, but figures frequently in narratives of the coming of the Anthropocene itself. I mean, this is Crutzen's early writing is, 1784 with Boulton and Watt's application of the steam engine to rotary movement. This is where the Anthropocene begins. Like that cast of characters, its broad influence in the material and visual culture, if you like to use those terms, of 18th century Britain and its colonies, it seems to me that it has to be reckoned with. And I felt like I couldn't not do it. So yeah, does that sort of get at it? I don't know if that's satisfactory. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. That's great.
Okay. So there would be the option for one last question. Monika Wagner.
So thanks very much for your brilliant combinations between picture making and the revolution, the Industrial Revolution in England. But I have a very old-fashioned question. Arnold Houbraken, the Netherlandish author and painter, reports about 17th century Netherlandish picture makers, painters, who were taken to court because their paint didn't last. It did change during very few years, and they had experimented with all sorts of chemical materials. So these customers did not accept that, and they were so. Houbraken reports that several of these painters were taken to court because the promises of the arts were to last and be there forever. So what happened to the customers of Reynolds? Was that a change of the mental image of what art meant, no longer being eternal, or what did it mean in that times?
That's a great question. That's not an old-fashioned one. That's wonderful. I don't know that case in particular, but I would say one of the stories often told when interpreting Reynolds's technical perversity is that this is an artifact of deregulation, that the guild structure in 18th century Britain has basically collapsed. The Painter-Stainers Company, which has search and seizure rights over visual art production, has effectively ceased to perform any regulation by about 1710. The court, the Hanoverian court, is a very minor player in the promotion of the visual arts. There's no state-sponsored artistic academy on par with the continent until 1768, 69. So it's an environment in which artists are able to sort of set up their shingle and offer their wares to whatever comers bring them trade. Now, that's one sort of story. There's another story told in which actually there is a desirability, and there's a discourse around patina, for example, in which the change of the picture in time in this moment is coming to take on a positive valuation, where the possibility that a Reynolds painting may evolve and may appreciate in value is seen as an incentive to acquire it. It's even been suggested that this is connected with elite gambling culture, and that part of the most unstable and the most critically untested components of Reynolds's production, his fancy pictures of the early 1770s in particular, which is sort of from which this James Coote's mahogany panel comes from. This is an era in which he's both trying out new kinds of pictorial genres. He's also experimenting heavily with chemical materials. And there's a sense in which these sort of social, artistic, and technical concerns intersect in a way. And the objective of pursuing these extremely expensive, but potentially very unstable paintings is that you show yourself socially to be the kind of client who is willing to take a chance, who's willing to take a hazard on that which may become incredibly valuable in time, but you can't see it when you purchase it. And this is part of the appeal. So goes one argument. I have a different argument in the book, which has to do with the Paracelsian homunculus, but I will not torture you with that. But it's a great question, and there are different ways in which it could shake out, but there is no sort of administration. There are no legal cases brought against Reynolds. This is something I've looked for, and I've also looked for if there are any ways in which we could apprehend these replicas that are offered by Boulton and Watt and so on and so forth as a form of insurance, which is a topic that I'm working on at the moment. And I don't really think it works, but I've tried to make the argument in various places. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. And also our time is approaching now the end already. And so I would like to take the opportunity to really thank you so much, Matthew, for the discussion, and also for the audience to be here with us. And also invite you, if you would like to, we will stay a little bit longer in the Zoom space. So if you would like to engage in a more informal discussion, also following up some of the questions that we raised now. Yeah, you are of course invited also to join this group. And yeah, thank you so much again, and hope to see you next time in the new book forum.